Welcome back to Louisiana. I am Samuel, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about knives. So this right here is a Microtech Ultratech that's been in my pocket for a couple months now, and it's actually just about entirely replaced my Benchmade emissary. So we're going to talk about kind of what makes a Microtech special, and also just how cool that OTF mechanism is. So yeah, let's get into the video. Yeehaw! So like I said, I've been carrying this knife every day for a couple months now, about 3 or 4 months here, and I have a few thoughts about what it's like to carry an OTF double-edged knife as your main daily carry. Some people say you can't do it. I disagree and say you can, but let's figure out why and just what makes a Microtech special. What makes these knives so good, and in my opinion, what makes them so great for EDC. Let's check it out. This is an out-the-front Microtech Ultratech. This thing is just like a sword, except it fits in your pocket. You can slice string, you can cut tape, and you can poke some paper. The knife that you can't have in California, Microtech Ultratech. All right, so now that you saw that short little ad and intro to what this knife is, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what makes this knife special and kind of differentiates it from other OTFs and similar knives, how usable it is, and then what it's like to actually use this knife if you're going to carry it every day and just treat it like a regular pocket knife. So first off, what makes this knife special? Well, this is made by Microtech Knives. So here I have their box, Microtech Knives. As you can see, never compromised, setting the standard for precision cutlery since 1994. So this company has been making knives for a good little while now, and they've really become well known in the OTF knife business. And Microtech's OTF knife lineup is really popular because of how reliable the system is. So there are some OTFs that with their mechanism, they just aren't 100% reliable, where every time you push that button forward, that blade's going to deploy. And what makes Microtech special is that you can rely on this knife to deploy just about as much as you can on any regular folding knife. And obviously there's going to be some user error. You know, you can mess up on a folding knife, you can mess up on any kind of knife, and you can still do that same thing on an OTF if you push the button kind of weird. Or you can always rely on this knife to deploy as long as you treat it right. As long as you treat this knife properly and maintain it pretty much the same you do with any normal knife, just keep the mechanism clean and maybe lightly oil it. This knife is going to be very reliable, and you can always rely on that blade to come out. It is double action, and what a double action OTF is, means you can push the deployment mechanism and the blade will deploy. And if you retract that deployment mechanism, whether it's a button or a switch here, when you pull it back, that blade will retract. Part of what makes a Microtech so special is because they have this system that allows the spring that pushes the blade and pulls it back in. That spring is only under load when you are actually pushing on that button. So your spring is going to last a very long time. It's not going to be worn out or stretched out. Now the downside of having a spring that does that is it makes your button pretty hard to push, because not only are you activating the mechanism, you're also loading up that spring. So you have to put enough force behind that button to load up the spring and then open this knife. And it takes a little getting used to as to your hand placement and thumb placement. And a big deal I've noticed in opening this knife is carrying your momentum. If you kind of get started and then run out of momentum, you cannot close this or open this. You have to have your momentum and just do it in one motion, and then this knife works well. But until you kind of learn the quirks of opening a Microtech, it can be kind of hard to do. Now we're going to talk about what it's like to actually use this knife every day. So as you notice, in my Ultratech here, it's a double-edged blade, and a lot of people say you cannot daily carry a double-edged blade because it's not very comfortable. It's just not very compliant with daily carrying, and personally, I would disagree. If you notice it starts getting a little dull and you just cut something really quick, well, guess what? You have a backup edge on the side that's just as sharp. And sometimes, depending on how you hold the knife, sometimes you want to make a cutting motion like this. Sometimes you want to make a more pulling motion like this, even though you really shouldn't cut towards you. Sometimes you just kind of have to do that depending on what your position is and what you're cutting. So it makes it easier to not have to transition the knife over and flip it like that, like you normally would. So there's a little convenience factor to having a double-edged blade, but it also does mean they have to be a little more conscientious of what you're doing. If you're cutting something close, you want to keep your other hand away from this sharp blade, and you can't choke down on it and put your thumb there for a very accurate, precise cut. And then there is one more problem with the double-edged blade that Microtech has actually done a very good job of mitigating. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about physics. So the way a cutting edge works on a knife, you have your actual cutting edge, which is a sharpened part, and you can see it. And then behind that edge you have the piece of metal, the blade stock, and it slowly tapers up to the thickest part, which is usually about here in the thick part of the blade. But right behind that edge, you want that metal to still be thin, because you can't just have a big old brick and then one little point, because that's not going to cut. The thinner you can keep it behind that edge, the better your knife will cut. And because you have to make 2 edges on a double-edged blade, you have to have 2 edges, 2 cutting sides, you're only restricted to half the distance to make those edges on the same width of blade, or thinner actually is, as it is in the case of Ultratech. So what that should mean is that this knife will not cut very well just for regular slicing, but Microtech has done a very good job with their blade geometry to mitigate that. So I'm going to take the single edge Benchmade and just make a cut through this paper, and you can see how easily it slices it. Now, this Ultratech, it's not going to cut as smoothly as that Benchmade did. Now, as you can see, it's kind of hanging up there. But for an OTF knife that has a double-edged blade, this is a very, very fine cutting edge. And this is not a perfect cut. It's not razor sharp. And this is still the factory edge that I've been using on this knife. And it's not as sharp as a single-edge Benchmade is right here. But with this edge on an Ultratech, you can always rely on it to cut. You might not get the cleanest or most precise cuts, but you can rely on it to cut. And one thing I love about this knife, it has M390 blade steel, and M390 is a super steel. It is one of the modern super steels. The edge retention on this steel is just next level. It does make it a little hard to sharpen, and it is a very brittle metal, and it is a little more prone to corrosion than some other steels out there. But your edge retention on this edge is just amazing. You're never having to resharpen it, and staying sharp for a long time. Now, of course, if you really bear down on this and go slicing through huge amounts of cardboard, then you're gonna dull your edge down here. But just for everyday carry, M390 blade steel is just it's pretty hard to beat. You, of course, have a really nice finish, which is surprisingly strong. I only have about 2 or 3 little marks on it where I've banged the finish off, unlike my Benchmade, which I've banged off a couple more times. And it's kind of interesting to note the difference in shades of the finishes here. I'm going to set this knife side by side. You can see what the finishes are like. And the last interesting thing to note is the blade finish. So here we have this Benchmade, which is not finished at all. And this Ultratech has what they call their apocalyptic stone wash, which is a very aggressive stone wash, and it really hides wear marks. I have a couple marks on this blade from cutting stuff, and even though I know where they are and I can find them, if I just took a picture of this knife or someone just looked at it, they probably would not be able to see where those marks are. But this knife, it does not fail. You can always rely on it. It's easy to use. It's a great everyday carry pocket knife just because of how robust that mechanism is, and how big it is. It fits in your hand, but even at the same time of it being long, it's not big in your pocket because it's so narrow and thin. Pretty much about the same dimensions in all other aspects as a small Benchmade emissary. Well, there you have my honest opinions about daily carrying a Microtech Ultratech. It is definitely a user-built and oriented knife, and there isn't too much on that you don't need, so it's an awesome knife to carry around. You just have to be aware of a couple things that I've talked about in this video. So I hope you enjoy it. Share it with your grandmother if you think she likes knives, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.